Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the host and creator of Dead Sleep. And if you are new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is a true crime podcast made for uninterrupted night listening. Mindful mysteries, no gore, no graphic violence, very scant use of the word grisly. And maybe what people like most about this show, there are no ads. No loud, obnoxious, pre-programmed ads to blast you awake just as you're about to fall asleep. If you thought that you were the only one, the only weirdo who likes to fall asleep to true crime, you're not. So join our little Dead Sleep community. Become a sleepy crime bear on Patreon. You can also subscribe via Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Some news from my day job as a journalist who works on other podcasts. I just released a new series, a limited series on Audible. It's a show I like to call Fargo on Four Legs because it is a very quirky true crime show about a unique serial killer case. I spent about a year reporting this story about a shadowy predator who roamed the streets of South London beginning in 2015, leaving scores, hundreds of victims behind. The twist: this killer's victims weren't humans. They were actually people's most beloved members of the family. Their pets, especially cats. And when detectives fall short in solving this case, a group of passionate animal lovers comprised of mostly badass, chain-smoking British ladies in their 50s, 60s, and 70s band together to hunt this killer down. So who is behind these killings? Is this cat killer even real? Find out on the Audible series, available both in the United States and the UK on Audible, called The Croydon Cat Killer. It's not a show for sleeping, but if you like a good mystery and if you like animals and you care about their welfare, you'll like this show. Again, it's The Croydon Cat Killer on Audible UK and Audible here in the United States. All right, that's my plug for the day. Now, let's settle in for the night. And as we are getting ready to relax and unwind, I wanted to ask a question, just to unclench our brains a little bit. Do you remember when exactly it turned? When you went from being someone who likes to watch shows involving murder and became a true crime obsessive. Obsessive isn't quite the right word. It's more like a true crime geek, a murder nerd, where you started following crime the way that other people might follow sports, baseball. When you became someone who didn't just know the names of the perpetrators, the killers, or the victims, you knew the names of the lawyers, the legal team, the district attorney. You knew these people like they were someone you knew. And for me, it started with The Staircase, the saga of Michael Peterson. Way back, like 20 years ago now, when it first came out. It was my first binge watch, at least that I can remember, where I consumed one episode after another, and over time, knew everyone on that case. There was Michael Peterson, of course, and his family, but then there was also David Rudolph, his defense attorney, and Frida Black. the notorious prosecutor. For others, it was making a murderer. That's when people fell in love with Stephen Avery's legal team, Dean Strang and Jerry Buting. And yet, there are still so many names we don't know. People behind the scenes and the stuff that they came up with that is so crucial. We sort of owe it to ourselves to find out who they are. And tonight's episode is about one of those people. A man I'll describe as the Forrest Gump of forensic science, who stumbled into a discovery that would transform baffling mysteries and unsolved cold cases into providing real-life answers for victims and families, and for the rest of us, true crime storytelling for decades to come. He was a scientist who made a discovery, had a eureka moment, driving along a California road. A nice, long, winding drive through the redwood forest in Northern California. A bright and sunny May afternoon in 1983. In the car was a man in his late 30s named Kary Mullis. Kary Mullis was about to turn 40, but he seemed younger. His energy was kind of surfer dude. A little bit Bill Paxton, a little bit Bill and Ted. You would never guess that groovy guy driving up the road that day, winding his way through the giant sequoia trees on a way to Mendocino in Northern California, you'd never know that he was a brilliant biochemist. And with every twist and turn in the road, as he made that 3-hour drive from his home in the Bay Area up to the secluded woods of Mendocino, with every twist and turn, his mind was twisting and turning as he tried to figure out one of the greatest puzzles known to humankind. Who are we? What are we made of? And what makes each one of us unique? It's a question that to many of us is existential. But in the mind of Kary Mullis, those questions of our identity, they were chemical. Kary spent the last several years of his life and career obsessing over one molecule, what he called the king molecule, a molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA. Of course, in the world of true crime, we all know what DNA is. Sort of. Tiny, tiny specks of stuff that's, say, scraped from under a fingernail, or found at a crime scene, or drawn from a scant bit of tissue. And in those little specks is an enormous amount of power. It can tell you everything you need to know about a person. Unique information about who each one of us is. That's drawn from the information found inside a single cell. Back in the early 1980s, DNA existed. They knew what it was. And at that time, labs like where Kary Mullis worked, they were interested in testing DNA so that they could get insight into viruses, into diseases. The problem for scientists like Kary was that sample DNA, it was hard to find. And being able to read the genetic code, it took a long time. To do the genetic testing that scientists wanted to do to help give insight into diseases, they needed a lot of sample DNA. And there was a quantity and a quality problem. Examining something, testing something rigorously, it takes repetition. And finding consistent and abundant, reliable samples was difficult. And the methods that biochemists had back then to copy DNA, it was time-consuming. It could take 6 months to copy a DNA strand. It would require the work of 40 people. So the notion of using something like DNA in a crime scene, it was unthinkable, impractical, and at that time, it was unheard of. But even back then, as far back as the 1970s, detectives were optimistic. They didn't know how or who or when exactly, but they'd hoped in a future forensic generation that all this stuff that we now understand is crucial evidence. They put all that stuff away. Those were cold cases. No one knew when they were going to be solved or how. Until Kary drove down that road. At least it was the spark. A moment that Kary Mullis would later describe as a eureka moment, when he realized a method of being able to duplicate, replicate, make photocopies, essentially, of DNA over and over and over again. What Kary Mullis came up with that day was something called polymerase chain reaction, better known as PCR. And I'm going to take a dead sleepy detour here to explain how PCR works. One way that Kary Mullis described it was that before PCR, DNA was like the loose tape that had fallen out of one of those old cassette tapes. Meant that the genetic material, the code, was all there. It was just very difficult to make sense of. What PCR did was essentially, and this is me talking now, an English major, not a scientist, but what PCR managed to do was take the material from that loose cassette tape, sample it, and create what you might think of as a music sample. A little snippet of the genetic code that you could reproduce over and over and over again. Like music, a simple sample like this that could be replicated over and over again without damaging the original source material at all. PCR amplified DNA, which meant you could have a tiny amount of it, a drop of blood. And for the first time ever, you'd be able to find decent DNA that you could use and test in that teeny tiny drop of blood. This would be revolutionary. It's hard to overstate how big this was. And like the name PCR suggests, its creation caused a chain reaction, put things in motion, especially in criminal investigations, unanswered questions, unthinkable tragedies. This development offered answers. The closest thing to closure for a cold case that anyone was going to get. And it changed Carrie's life too. At that time when Carrie thought of it, that eureka moment in the car ride up to Mendocino, he thought to himself, this is going to make me famous. I'm going to win the Nobel Prize. And he was right. That day in May was just the spark. It would take years, nearly a decade, before PCR became something that you could do in a machine about the size of a fax machine. And it was expensive, so it would take time for crime labs to be able to have access to this type of technology. But by the early 90s, it was recognized as a huge achievement. So much so that in 1993, Kary Mullis won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work in discovering PCR. Now, there's a footnote, a detail in that story, one that would prove controversial. That one of the reasons that Kary says he was able to come up with this whole idea, this connection between PCR and DNA, it all came courtesy of a drug that is also known by 3 letters, LSD. Kary was already an unorthodox type of chemist. He was their outside-the-box thinker. And psychedelic drugs, it appears, helped him stay well outside that box. And again, it would take time for law enforcement and science to come together. After all, a DNA sample isn't worth much if there isn't a person you can match it to. Which led to the eventual creation of a DNA criminal database created by the FBI called CODIS. CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. An early version of CODIS launched in 1990. And back then, like now, there were ethical and legal concerns. Then in 1994 came some game-changing legislation. When Congress passed the DNA Identification Act, which gave the FBI permission to create a nationwide database of individual offender DNA, one that would eventually become the largest in the world. It was controversial then, it's controversial now, but there are over 17 million DNA samples of offenders in that database, along with millions of other samples of people who have been arrested but not convicted, along with those who have volunteered to give their DNA, even if they haven't been accused of any crime, but were swabbed, say, as part of an investigation, a way to rule them out. And it was in 1994, around the time of all of this incredible accessibility to these tools, all of this thanks to Kary Mullis, that Kary's own life started to change. Kary had everything he wanted. He was famous. He was successful. He was at the peak of his career when, tragically, he was struck with a tragic illness. And he showed signs very early signs of a very rare affliction, one that so few people have that there's no apparent cure for it. It wouldn't be anything Carrie could look at. It isn't genetic, though this condition did appear to be passed down from one person to the next. And if Carrie wasn't careful, it risked destroying his entire life. The disease that some of his peers in the scientific community believed he had was something called Nobelitis, a disorder of sorts, exclusively observed in a subset of very special people, Nobel laureates. Nobelitis, also known as Nobel disease, it starts with the inflammation of the ego that gives people who have won the Nobel Prize this illusion of superhuman powers, especially in the world of science, where they believe that the Nobel Prize is just the beginning, and they're going to do even bigger and better things. This confidence, this assurance in their intellect, leads those who have the condition of Nobel Prize disease to say and do some shocking, abhorrent things. Take, for instance, James Watson. James Watson was awarded the Nobel Prize in medicine, along with Francis Crick and Maurice Wilkins, in 1962. These gentlemen were the forefathers of DNA. They were the ones who discovered the molecular structures of the nucleic acids, that there was information inside this living material. James Watson's strain of Nobel disease, like many other Nobel disease sufferers, manifests itself in racial comments, the promotion of eugenics, the idea that some races are inferior/superior to other races. After winning the Nobel Prize for his achievements in genetic science, he'd claim that some races had higher sex drives relative to the amount of melanin in their skin. And Nobelitis, it sounds funny. It's like a joke. Except he is just one example of the many other Nobel Prize winners who would go on to say out loud some pretty crazy stuff. Now, Kary Mullis was already an eccentric dude, and he was anti-establishment, a contrarian who didn't like to play by the rules. So it's unclear if he had the beginnings of Nobelitis, but this was a choice that he made, poised at the height of his scientific career. He made a decision in 1995, 2 years after the Nobel Prize, to hit the road once again. Only this time he wasn't headed 3 hours up to a quiet cabin in Mendocino with the love of his life. He was headed down to LA to sit in a claustrophobic courtroom, packed with people, millions watching on TV. Kary Mullis was in court as a paid expert, there to give testimony in the biggest double murder trial of the century, the People versus O.J. Simpson. Kary Mullis was invited by O.J. Simpson's defense team to be their expert witness. And they wanted their expert witness to do something really important for their case. There were no witnesses in the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. So DNA evidence, tiny drops of blood, were what prosecutors were relying on to make their case. And Carey's job, as the inventor, essentially, of PCR, was to poke holes and to testify that the evidence that they collected as an expert in PCR couldn't be trusted. Now, this is the mid-1990s, and the O.J. Simpson case, as you know, was landmark in its use of and reliance on DNA as a case against O.J. Simpson. This was before CSI, and this was when jurors, ordinary people like us, didn't really understand it, or at least we didn't trust it. It would take time, and I think a lot of true crime and TV watching, for us to have faith in the veracity of DNA evidence. Someone like Kary Mullis, the man behind PCR, a Nobel Prize-winning laureate, his testimony had the potential to be very powerful. And again, he was there to make a case against the very evidence that he created, which seems strange. In his memoir, which I'll link to in the show notes, he made some valid points about how a lot of police departments, including the LAPD, couldn't be trusted with how they collect their DNA samples. That anything that an average, ordinary cop or detective, or even your basic medical examiner, what they would collect, certainly from a crime scene, wouldn't have the integrity that an essential DNA sample would in a lab. In his memoir, Kary Mullis doesn't seem to realize, or really care, that it's a murder case, a double murder case, and that O.J. Simpson might very well be guilty. What he remembers is Marcia Clark's hair, and how clever he was going to be once he got on that witness stand. In his mind, he's just there to testify, to say what he knows, and be handsomely paid for it. During the trial, it seemed Cary's Nobel disease encouraged him to do some bizarre things that no expert in his right mind should do. It's hard to imagine someone upstaging O.J. Simpson, or Johnny Cochran, or of all of those personalities that were part of his defense team. But one day, Kary managed to, when the camera panned the courtroom and Kary made eye contact with the camera and smiled in the middle of the trial. In another part of the trial, Kary, who was sitting in court, preparing to be the expert witness at any moment, was watching a woman who was testifying on behalf of O.J. Simpson. He found this woman attractive. By then, Kary, who'd been divorced a few times, was single, in his late 40s, early 50s, and liked what he saw on the witness stand. And again, this is 100% true. He wrote a note to O.J. Simpson in the courtroom and somehow managed to have it passed to him. That note to O.J. Simpson read something to the effect of that Kary found this woman very attractive. Could he have her phone number? Would O.J. mind if he asked her out? According to Kary Mullis, O.J. wrote back, and he said he didn't have her number, or that he wasn't sure if he could give him the number, and, by the way, he wished he could take her out. Then, of course, more background came out around Kary Mullis and his use of LSD. And between the use of psychedelics, along with his own bad behavior with women in his past, including some charges of domestic violence himself, This made him a complicated witness. And in the end, at least what Carrie was told, was that they didn't really need his testimony because they had the DNA stuff all figured out. But you can't help but wonder if maybe it was Carrie's arrogance, his flare-ups of Nobel disease, that influenced whether or not they were going to put that guy, a man for whom O.J. Simpson had to define some boundaries, that really was saying something. Between his Nobel Prize and his O.J. Simpson notoriety, Carrie really began to think of himself as a pretty big celebrity. And at least in his mind, people recognized him wherever he went. And again, this is all in his memoir that he wrote about going to a strip club, and while he was there, someone taking his picture, someone recognizing him. He imagined them knowing him as Dr. DNA. Maybe what he said was true. Maybe people did recognize him in strip clubs or wherever he went. But his reputation in the science community was tarnished. And ultimately, Kary Mullis's greatest accomplishment in the world of biochemistry was the PCR. When he died in 2019, at the age of 74, there were people who admired him and thought he was a genius, and there were people who found him to be a reckless promoter of bad information, who was embraced by the conspiracy theory community. And he was making appearances on these conspiracy theory anti-vaxxer podcasts. He was a climate change denier. And maybe most disturbing, suggested that HIV didn't cause AIDS. And one of the reasons why Nobel disease is often incurable is because people don't often challenge a Nobel laureate, especially in the sciences. They're considered untouchable. Even if one does push back, there are plenty of others out there that are willing to buy into whatever someone like Kary Mullis is saying. Which shouldn't undo the incredible work that Kary Mullis did, especially in the world of cold cases. A murder of a young girl, a teenager, that took place all the way back in the 80s, right around the time that Kary was dreaming up this idea of PCR. A young girl was killed on her way to school. And for decades, they had no idea who did it. And the reason why was because of the lack of evidence. The only evidence they had on the perpetrator amounted to 15 cells. Just 15 cells. And thanks to those advancements in biotechnology and the ability to quickly and efficiently copy DNA, they were able to find the man who killed that little girl. All of that on just 15 cells. That's just one of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases that were solved thanks to PCR and Kary Mullis's work. So as complicated as Kary Mullis's legacy might be, for those of us who create and consume true crime as a genre, we'd have no forensic files. We'd have no true crime. There'd be no cold cases that worth any hope of solving. All we would have is unsolved mysteries. And I suppose in this very informative Dead Sleep episode, if we can learn anything, if we can extract one piece of advice, if someone offers you the Nobel Prize, don't accept it. thank you for listening to a very special The More You Know Dead Sleep episode. I'll be back next week with a really complicated narrative true crime mystery that I'm so excited to share with you. Until then, nighty night.